The Hive on the Hill. The town of Claymore had always been quiet, tucked away between rolling hills and thick woods that cut it off from the world. A place where the sun felt warmer, the breeze carried whispers of forgotten times, and the silence of the night was a comfort. But that silence had changed. Now it was thick and oppressive, clinging to the streets like a suffocating shroud. It started with the sound, a low, droning hum that echoed through the valley, so subtle at first that no one thought much of it. Just the wind, some had said. The old-timers brushed it off, called it nature's tune. But as the nights wore on, the hum grew louder, more insistent. It gnawed at you, wormed its way into your dreams until sleep became an act of desperation. The first to go missing was Old Man Connors. Folks figured he wandered off into the woods, lost his way like he sometimes did after one too many shots of whiskey. But when his dog turned up on the edge of town, half-eaten and swarmed by flies, something in the air shifted. We all felt it. The unease, the fear scratching at the back of our minds, though no one dared to say it out loud. Not until the Wilkins boy disappeared. He was only 12, riding his bike home after dark when his mother heard it. That hum, louder now, vibrating through the walls of their house. She looked out the window and saw the boy's bike lying on its side in the road, but he was gone. Not a scream, not a trace. Just that damn humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The town came together after that, meeting in the church basement like they always did when things got bad. There were whispers, rumors about something building up on the hill that overlooked Claymore. Some said they'd seen lights flickering in the distance. Others swore they saw something, moving. But it wasn't until Sheriff Graham spoke that the room fell silent. "They're bees," he said, his voice low and grave. "Big as your goddamn head." The room erupted with laughter, but there was no humor in the sheriff's eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a jar, slamming it onto the table. Inside was the biggest bee I'd ever seen, its body dark and glossy, wings still twitching as if it hadn't quite died. "Caught this out by Connor's place. There's a nest up on the hill. I've seen it." No one laughed after that. That night, the town locked its doors, bolted windows, and stayed inside. But it didn't matter. We heard the hum before we saw them, a dark cloud moving against the night sky, descending from the hill like a plague. And then the screams began. From my window, I watched as they tore through the town. Giant bees with shining, armor-like bodies and stingers that glinted in the moonlight like knives. They moved fast, too fast to fight, ripping people from their homes, dragging them into the air as if they weighed nothing. Blood splattered the streets, glistening under the street lamps before being swallowed by the darkness. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to steady my breath. They wouldn't find me. Not if I stayed quiet, not if I didn't move. And then the hum stopped. A silence so complete it felt unnatural fell over the town. I dared to peek through the curtains, and what I saw made my blood run cold. They were gathering, circling above the church, their enormous bodies blocking out the stars. And in the middle of them, suspended by hundreds of writhing legs, was something even more horrifying. A shape, larger than the rest, descending slowly toward the ground. It was the Queen, her massive pulsating body glistening in the moonlight as she landed on the church roof. I watched in horror as her abdomen split open, spewing thousands of eggs across the roof, down the walls, spilling into the streets. And that's when I realized we weren't just dealing with a swarm. This was an invasion. The Queen's eyes glowed in the dark, and for the briefest moment, I swear she looked right at me. The hum returned, louder this time, shaking the walls of my house. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing, breath shallow. Outside, the screaming had started again, but this time it was worse. Much worse. The screams outside grew more desperate, rising like a tidal wave of terror that crashed against every door and window in Claymore. I could hear people begging, pleading for help as the buzzing swarmed over them, but no one came. No one could. It was like the whole town had been swallowed by the sound, drowned in it. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched in the corner of my living room, hands clamped over my ears as if that would block out the horror happening just outside. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of something that had no explanation. Giant bees? A queen? This wasn't real. It couldn't be real, but the screams and the splatter of blood on the pavement outside told me otherwise. When the hum subsided, I crept to the window again, as cautiously as I could. The sight that greeted me was something I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. The town square was a massacre. Bodies lay strewn across the street, twisted and broken, many of them barely recognizable. Some were still being dragged, leaving thick trails of blood behind them as the monstrous bees hauled them back toward the hill. Limbs dangled like grotesque trophies from the creature's legs, and the ground shimmered with the sheen of spilled guts and gore. I gagged but forced myself to look, forced myself to understand what we were dealing with. The hill. It all came from the hill. I turned away, trembling, trying to think. The sheriff's words echoed in my head. There's a nest up there. A nest meant there was a queen. And if there was a queen, she had to be killed. But how? What could anyone do against something that size? Something so unnatural? The people of Claymore didn't stand a chance, not without a plan. I didn't know if there was anyone left to plan anything, but I wasn't about to die waiting for those monsters to tear through my door. I gathered myself, breathing in ragged gulps as I grabbed the only weapon I could think of, a kitchen knife. Pathetic maybe, but it was better than nothing. I had to move fast, had to find anyone else who had survived the night, anyone who might know how to fight back. Stepping outside, the stench hit me first. The air was thick with it, a nauseating mixture of decay and something worse. Something that stung the back of my throat and burned in my lungs. The street was slick beneath my feet, blood and viscera coating the ground in a morbid layer of death. I swallowed hard and kept moving. I made my way to the church, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in where the queen had landed, massive claw-like gouges marking her descent. The eggs she'd left behind still writhed in a thick, gelatinous muck, pulsing as if ready to hatch any second. I tried not to think about what would crawl out when they did. That's when I heard it, a low, pained moan coming from the shadows near the church steps. I tightened my grip on the knife and followed the sound. There, slumped against the cracked stone, was Sheriff Graham. He was barely recognizable. His face was covered in deep, oozing welts, his skin pale and waxy. One of his legs had been torn clean off, the stump wrapped in a hastily tied bandage that was already soaked through with blood. He looked up at me, his eyes dull and glassy. But there was something else behind them, something wild. "They're coming for you," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "They don't stop. Not until... He trailed off, his eyes drifting toward the hill, his hand reaching out to point at it. "The queen," he managed, his breath rattling. "She's the key. Kill her, and maybe they'll stop." Before I could respond, he let out a horrible, gurgling cough, and his body seized, convulsing. A low buzzing sound began to rise, but this time it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from inside him. I stumbled back, the realization dawning on me too late. Something moved beneath his skin. I watched in horror as his chest began to bulge, the flesh stretching and splitting as something inside pushed its way out. His eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the buzzing grew louder, filling the air around us. And then, with a sickening tear, the thing burst free. A giant bee, its body dripping with blood and gore as it crawled out of him, its wings fluttering in the thick night air. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The knife slipped from my hand as I bolted, not daring to look back. I could hear the buzzing behind me, hear the wet slaps of its wings as it took to the air. But I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. And that's when I saw it, looming in the distance, the hill where it all began. The Hive. It was enormous, towering over the landscape like some grotesque monument. Its walls made of a dark, pulsating material that seemed almost alive. The hum was louder now, louder than it had ever been. And as I stared up at that monstrosity, I realized something else. It wasn't just the bees that were watching. Something else was up there. Something worse. And it had seen me. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they'd collapse under me as I stood at the edge of town, staring at that grotesque, pulsating hive on the hill. The dark mass seemed to throb with life, its walls rippling like a living thing. The hum was deafening now, a low, bone-rattling drone that vibrated through my skull, burrowing deep into my thoughts. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Behind me, the town was a graveyard. I glanced back, expecting the monstrous bee that had crawled out of Sheriff Graham's body to still be chasing me, but it was gone. The streets were empty, littered with the remains of those who had been unlucky enough to be caught in the first wave. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or terrified by the silence, but it was too quiet. No buzzing, no screams, just that maddening hum from the hill, calling me, drawing me closer. I don't know why I started walking toward it, but my feet moved on their own, like I was being pulled by some invisible force. Maybe it was the queen, maybe it was something worse. The closer I got to the hill, the darker the sky became. Thick clouds churned above, blocking out the stars and the moon, casting everything in a sickly, unnatural light. It felt like the world was closing in on itself, shrinking until only the hive and I remained. The path up the hill was slick with mud and something else, something sticky that clung to my shoes with each step. I dared a glance down and immediately regretted it. The ground was littered with pieces of what used to be people. Arms, legs, torn strips of flesh that had been stripped to the bone. I gagged, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat, but I couldn't stop moving. Something was waiting for me up there. I reached the top of the hill, and there it was. The hive, Up close, it was even more horrifying. An enormous structure that stretched high into the sky, made of some unholy mixture of wax and flesh. It looked like a twisted version of a beehive, but there was something wrong about it. The surface rippled and pulsed as if it were breathing, as if it had a life of its own. I took a step closer, my knife forgotten in my hand. My heart pounded so loud in my chest that I thought it might burst. And then the entrance appeared. An opening in the hive's side, wide enough to walk through. But it looked more like a gaping mouth, wet and glistening. I didn't want to go inside. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. There was no running from this. If I didn't stop it, there'd be no town left. No people. Just the hum. Forever. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The air was thick and humid, almost suffocating, and the walls were lined with rows upon rows of dripping honeycomb-like structures. But it wasn't honey they were filled with. Each cell contained a human, still alive, their bodies bound by a sticky, web-like substance, their faces frozen in silent screams. Their eyes followed me as I passed, pleading, but I couldn't help them. I could barely help myself. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor and the walls, drilling into my skull. I tried to keep my thoughts focused, but it was like the sound was inside me now, scrambling my mind. And then I saw her, the queen. She sat in the center of the hive, her massive body draped across the chamber like a nightmare come to life. Her thorax was swollen and pulsating, dripping with black ichor as eggs fell from her abdomen, one after another. But it was her eyes that caught me, glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. She saw me the moment I stepped into the chamber. I knew it. She had been waiting. Her voice wasn't a sound. It was in my head, a thick, suffocating presence that smothered my thoughts. Come closer. My body moved without my permission, drawn toward her. Her massive, segmented legs twitched as I approached, and I could feel her power, her control, wrapping around me like a vice. I was close now, close enough to see the rows of mouths lining her abdomen, all of them filled with sharp teeth, gnashing and grinding as they devoured the bodies of the townspeople trapped inside her eggs. My stomach turned, but I couldn't stop. I raised the knife, my arm trembling, but it felt like I was moving through molasses. The queen's laughter echoed inside my head, dark and mocking. You cannot stop me, human. Just as I prepared to strike, something shifted behind me. A rustle. The air felt different, cold. I spun around, knife raised, expecting another one of her drones, but what I saw made my blood freeze. It wasn't a bee. It was me. Standing there in the entrance was me. Or something that looked like me. It had my face, my clothes, but its eyes. They were black, hollow pits, and its mouth twisted into a sickening smile. Before I could react, the thing lunged at me, grabbing my arm with a strength I didn't have. I tried to scream, but it shoved me back toward the queen, who was waiting with open jaws, ready to devour me whole. And that's when I realized I had never been the one fighting my way up the hill. I had never been the one holding the knife. The whole time I had been trapped inside the hive. The queen had already consumed me. The figure in the entrance? It was the real me, transformed, consumed by the hive. And I was about to become part of it forever. But then something happened. The figure in front of me flickered. It wasn't real. It was another trick, another nightmare. The queen's laughter faltered for a moment, and that's when I realized I wasn't done yet. My mind cleared, and I reached for the pack strapped to my back. The explosives, C4. I had come prepared, even if the queen had tried to make me forget. My hands moved quickly, setting the charges around the chamber, planting the last one right beneath her bloated, pulsating form. Her voice screamed inside my head, "You cannot stop me!" But she was wrong. I grabbed the detonator from my belt, my finger trembling as I backed away toward the entrance of the hive. The queen thrashed, her monstrous legs crashing against the walls of the chamber, but I didn't stop. I ran. I sprinted down the hill, my breath ragged, heart hammering in my chest as I ran. The detonator was in my hand, ready. All I had to do was push the button. When I reached the base of the hill, I turned, glancing back at the hive one last time. The queen, massive and grotesque, had started to emerge, her many eyes scanning the night as if sensing something was wrong. Her body, swollen with eggs, shifted grotesquely as she rose up on her spindly legs. The ground seemed to tremble under her weight, and her wings, too large and too heavy, buzzed weakly. She was coming. Not today, I muttered under my breath. I slammed my thumb down on the detonator. For a split second, nothing happened. The world seemed to hang in that moment, a quiet, tense pause. And then, boom! The explosion rocked the entire hill, a deafening roar that split the night sky in two. Fire erupted from the base of the hive, bright orange flames licking up the walls as the structure crumbled. The queen let out a high-pitched screech, her massive body flailing as the fire consumed her. She tried to lift off, her wings buzzing frantically, but it was too late. The second wave of explosions went off, sending chunks of the hive flying in every direction. The queen, engulfed in flames, let out one last terrible wail before collapsing into the inferno, her enormous body dissolving into ash. The hive collapsed in on itself, the buzzing finally silenced. I stood there panting, watching as the flames swallowed the remnants of the hive. The fire crackled, the smell of burning flesh thick in the air. But the buzzing, the horrific hum that had haunted us for so long was gone. It was over. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces pale and drawn, but alive. The survivors gathered at the base of the hill, staring at the smoldering ruins of the hive, disbelief and relief washing over them in waves. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of it all finally hitting me. It was done. We had won. Sheriff Graham, limping from his injuries but still standing, approached me. His face was ashen, his eyes wide, but there was a spark of hope there that I hadn't seen in days. "You did it," he said quietly. "You really did it." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. The fire blazed behind me, a beacon of destruction but also of survival. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to breathe. The smell of smoke and charred remains filled the air, but it was a smell that brought with it a strange sense of relief. The town of Claymore had been through hell, but we had made it through. Somehow we had survived. In the days that followed, the fire smoldered out, leaving only ash and blackened earth where the hive once stood. The town was still in ruins, the streets stained with the memories of those who had been lost. But there was something different now. A quiet resilience. The survivors, the ones who had cowered in their homes while the swarm had ravaged the streets, had begun to rebuild. Together they cleared the debris, repaired what could be saved, and mourned what was gone. I spent my time on the hill, watching as life slowly returned to Claymore. The hum that had once haunted every night was gone, replaced by the sound of hammers and voices, a sign that we were still here, still fighting. But there were still the memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the queen's bloated form, her many eyes glowing with malice as she had tried to consume me. I could feel the buzzing in my skull, the cold wet air of the hive closing in around me. Sometimes it was hard to believe it was all over, but as I stood there looking out over the town, I knew it was. We had won. The queen was dead, and her monstrous army of bees had been destroyed with her. One day as I walked through the half-rebuilt streets, I found Sheriff Graham sitting on the porch of what used to be his office. His leg had been crudely bandaged, and he looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of a week, but his eyes were clear. He saw me approach and gave me a nod. "I don't think I ever thanked you," he said, his voice gravelly from exhaustion, "for what you did. You saved us." "I did what I had to," I replied, the weight of those words heavy in my chest. "We all did." He looked down at the ground, the silence between us stretching out. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Do you think it's really over?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out toward the hill where the hive had once stood. The earth was blackened and scorched, but there were no signs of life, no buzzing, no hum. Just quiet. "I think so," I said after a moment. "The queen's gone. They won't come back." The sheriff nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. We both knew that the trauma of what had happened would linger, that it would take time for Claymore to heal, if it ever truly could. But we were still here, and that meant something. As I turned to leave, the sheriff called out again, his voice carrying a strange note of hope. "You think the bees were the only thing they were hiding up in those mountains?" I stopped, my stomach tightening at the thought. Claymore had always been a quiet town, isolated, and it had seemed like the perfect place to hide something as terrifying as those genetically engineered bees. But the sheriff's words lingered in the back of my mind. Was there something else? Something even worse? I shook off the thought. The bees were dead and the hive was destroyed. That was all that mattered. As I walked away, the sun began to set behind the hills, casting a warm golden glow over the town. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel afraid. The town of Claymore had been through hell, but we had survived. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. We were free. The hive on the hill was no more.